So the next speaker is Andrea. She described herself as a maker of things across artistic medias, and she has an intensive, continuous, and evolving relationship in music and community engagement. And her topic today is about indigenizing relationships. So please give a warm applause to our speaker.
Okay. I am Otter Clan from Siksika, Pikani, Kainai, Anishinaabe, Nahiao, mixed European, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern backgrounds. Thank you for the land acknowledgement earlier. I also would like to insert that these territories were also accessed by Haudenosaunee peoples, and that it was a gathering place, so many nations have accessed these lands. So I have a bit of, I suppose, an internal perspective on activism. I prefer the term mobilizer or protector. Activism has a bit of a kind of a tainted connotation at this point in time. And in coming from an Indigenous community, it's definitely the case that you may be being spied on because I definitely am on all the bad lists. I work with an organization. It's actually a project under the Polaris Institute called Indigenous Climate Action. We are so-called Canada's premier Indigenous-led climate justice organization. We have a lot of different scopes of work. I won't be able to get into all of that today. But I think some of the more successful strategies that we've been able to work with is what had been commented on earlier, which is coalition building. We are a member of a so-called US-based group called Grassroots Global Justice, and in that we are also part of a coalition called It Takes Roots, which is Indigenous Environmental Network, Climate Justice Alliance, and Rights to the City. And you may have seen some of the work that has come out of these movements. To state that Indigenous Climate Action is a brand new organization. We've just celebrated our year of core staff, so much of this work precedes us, but most recently we were in San Francisco in September to counter some of the GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit events. And now if you're familiar, Jerry Brown is the governor of California, and he is noted in the mainstream as having very progressive and thoughtful climate perspectives. And as Indigenous peoples, we disagree. There's a lot of greenwashing, obviously, that we know that happens. A lot of cases, this is corporations trying to sell carbon offsetting, this type of thing. And we need to acknowledge the fact that as an Indigenous body, we are up against a really big hurdle. Under the Canadian Constitution, we are not considered human beings. This is the reason why the Indian Act is part of the law, is that Canadians are under the Canadian Constitution, yet we are part of the Indian Act. And currently there is an omnibill that is supposed to go through Parliament, but they say that it's not going to happen before the federal election. And this is much concern because it definitely is a new proposed Indigenous rights recognition framework, which essentially is going to alleviate the Canadian government of any responsibility of its historical oppression of Indigenous peoples. And so we have a different kind of role here as protectors. In many cases, we have to kind of share the true history of where we are actually at in the so-called Canadian landscape. And that is that we have to debunk a lot of things such as what I just told you, and that, for example, the band council system, you know, like $10 million gets invested into our reservation programs, basically, annually. And this causes a lot of concern for Canadians because they feel like we get a free ride. Well, we also need to consider that the Crown and Crown corporations have been pillaging so-called resources, and 75% of extractive industries are actually Canadian corporations. The Boreal Forest is the largest tree mine in the whole world. It supersedes the Amazon in terms of extraction about 2 years ago. And the tar sands is the world's largest industrial project in the world. Cleanup is noted around about $260 billion at this point, and they're proposing another mine to be set right up against that, which is Tech Frontier, and that is supposed to be the next biggest industrial project. So I want to talk a little bit about the Boreal Forest, and I want to talk a little bit about us being in California, because we were with a lot of other Indigenous folks from Turtle Island, Central and South America. So we were with some Brazilian folks, we were with some Quechua, some Sariaku, folks from Mexico, the southern United States, and we saw this as an opportunity because noting that the Boreal is the most mined area and the Amazon is being devastated. It is actually a lot less safe for people down there. There's a lot of death threats. People are being murdered. They're being killed. They're being killed by, in my opinion, corporations and people who have been hired to do this type of work. So we also need to be aware of the magnitude of which this work is being so-called done for progress. So we decided to write a declaration. And this was written from many tar sands impacted community members, mostly women, as well as that list of people that I just described. And we decided to confront one of the meetings that the Governor General was holding, which was called the Climate Change and Forests Task Force. It's kind of a tongue twister. And it was a very last minute action that we decided to do. And so we had one of the Southern delegates, Marlon, he presented this letter. We weren't able to get inside immediately. We started at 8:30 in the morning and we collected en masse. And our goal was that we wanted to get inside the meeting. And so luckily we had a couple of allies that had been working within this group, and so we had a little bit of inside information that was definitely of benefit to us. And due to the fact that we had created such a crowd outside, they were part of this coalition that I had described. So they were from all over the so-called south of the Medicine Line in US. And it kind of took a life of its own. So we had the Ohlone peoples, which is the traditional territory in San Francisco, as part of our security team, and they were there to ensure that we were all going to be safe. They were there to ensure that if any arrests were made, that it would be of those people, because it would be a little bit easier to deal with any types of arrests or any types of legal action, so that we didn't have to worry about people flying in and out of the country or having to deal with these types of costs. It would be a little less costly for them. So that was of great benefit to us. And so we had a huge, I guess, it was almost like a plenary, people just talking about where they were at in terms of pushing back on these types of policies, and that there's virtually no consent of peoples in order to do these things. Much like the way that the band council system works in Canada, it's a divide and conquer tactic. So bringing in people that I guess you could call them are being coerced, or okay, I have 2 minutes. And so I kind of want to insert something here before I continue my story. Because our communities are so divided, I would never blame a group of people for wanting to head this direction of co-opting their resources in order to have a better life for their people. So there were some people that were actually Quechua in this meeting, and we were able to, through these people having these conversations outside and the pressure of the whole coalition, raise enough fuss that the folks came outside from the meeting. And once that was done, the declaration was read. And it was really impressive because there was about a half a dozen people from the meeting standing outside with us. And unbeknownst to us, the bulk of the group in the crowd started chanting, "Let them in." So the first time in history that I've heard of, we actually were able to get inside the meeting and have about a half an hour of discussion to talk about the reasoning why we wanted to have this declaration written, that our resources are not for sale, that that these kinds of ways are dividing and conquering our peoples and our lands, and that they are part of the process of distraction in order for corporations to come in and gain more control. So I know that this is only one small example, and I could talk forever about it, but that's what I was compelled to say. I would love to table any questions, and thank you so much for having me.